Let's go back to our Caracas studios where we were talking to Vijay Prashad, the Director of the Tricontinental Institute. Hello Vijay, can you hear us now?
Yes, live and direct. Thanks a lot. Live and direct.
That is great. We were so sorry to interrupt you. Of course, election day has these things. We are coming and going from live news. But really, we are here to understand the relevance and the importance of this day and also of this election that has been widely followed from everywhere in the world. And I was telling you before, I wanted to start by analyzing the repercussion that this has had abroad and also how part of the opposition has been trying to say that there could be fraud here just even before, weeks before the election. And an important part of the international media has picked up on this. So I wanted to ask you, what is your take on this? Is there a possibility of this? How viable is the electoral system in Venezuela according to your opinion?
Well, you know, I've covered a number of elections in Venezuela and in other parts of the world. It's always an interesting business when you look at elections and when you follow how these systems work. Particularly when we move to digital systems, people continue to have doubts about them. They are scared, they don't have paper ballots. But I must say, from everything I've learned, from what the Venezuelan government, the CNE, the National Election System, what they've done is quite remarkable. They've built a modern election system, looks pretty foolproof. It's understandable that an opposition would start to manage expectations, to start to say things like there's going to be fraud. All around the world, we hear this at a time of elections. The reason this is such an important election might have something to do with global affairs, not to do with Venezuela directly. You know, the United States needs Venezuelan oil to come back into the international market. Having sanctioned Russia, the Europeans are in dire need of oil, and that's what the United States was counting upon. There was a Barbados agreement between the government and the opposition. The idea of the Barbados agreement was that if this election was fair, the United States would start slowing the sanctions down. Venezuelan oil could go to Europe, and that would save the Europeans from something that the United States has imposed on that country. So there's a kind of double process here. On the one side, the United States is desperate to get Venezuelan oil back on the market. On the other side, the opposition is desperate to try to win this election and be the ones who deliver the oil to Europe and to deliver, I think, a surrender to the United States. So this is an election about Venezuela, certainly, but it's also really about geopolitics, matters far away from Maracaibo, from Amazonia, and so on, matters having to do with the United States and its imposition of a conflict on Europe.
So clearly from what you were saying, first, there was no real evidence of these claims that both international agents and media were claiming regarding these elections. And of course, another key aspect has to do with international interference and particularly the role that the U.S. is playing in all of this. And just minutes ago, U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris issued a post on social network X regarding the Venezuelan elections. What did she say and what is your read on this?
Well, it's very interesting. The polls in Caracas officially close at 6 p.m. That's when the polling stations across the country are supposed to lock their doors. Only those within can vote. 23 minutes after the polls closed in Caracas and in other parts of Venezuela, Kamala Harris, the Vice President of the United States and the presidential candidate from the Democratic Party for the November election in the United States, released a tweet. 23 minutes afterwards, the tweet very quickly got over almost 2 million retweets. That means that A lot of people at least looked at this tweet, paid attention to it. What did she say in it? On the surface, it's a completely bland statement. She says that, you know, the election has happened, the United States government is going to watch it carefully, the people of Venezuela have voted. And then there's a key line in the tweet which I think people should pay attention to. She writes, despite the many challenges, we will continue to work toward a more democratic, etc., etc. In a way, Kamala Harris seemingly is conceding the fact that the opposition may not have won this election. Despite the many challenges, we will continue to work. This means that the United States might be willing to concede the opposition hasn't won, the Barbados Agreement should go ahead, and Venezuelan oil should enter European markets. That's one, I think, pretty generous reading of Kamala Harris's tweet. But I'd just like to say something about her own bona fides. Pay attention to the fact that Kamala Harris is now going to be the Democratic Party's nominee for the President of the United States. But she didn't participate in even one primary election to win the spot at the head of the Democratic ticket. In other words, she was parachuted into that role. It's rather odd for Kamala Harris, who was undemocratically parachuted into the role of being the Democratic candidate for President of the United States, to now lecture people about democracy. She herself has been a beneficiary of undemocratic means, and here she is trying to tell the world about democracy. It's so typical of the hypocritical behavior of politicians in the United States.
So unfortunately, it seems that this media narrative, also imposed by all of this interest that you were talking about, really prevents us from thinking, as we would do in any other election, which are the models of country that are being confronted in this context. So I would like to get into that discussion. That part of the opposition has been very skillful to skip. On one hand, the ruling party is betting on economic recovery after the impact of the so-called sanctions, to relaunching national production and self-sufficiency in order to reduce the dependency of its economy. But on the other hand, the opposition repeats ultra-liberal speeches like those being exercised in Argentina with Milei, for example. How would you describe this difference in production models on what is at stake here in Venezuela?
Well, you know, I was in Venezuela in the 1990s during the administration of Mr. Perez. At the time, Perez, who was a pretty ordinary social democratic president, had told the Venezuelan people, I promise not to come to the International Monetary Fund. I promise not to beg them to provide small amounts of money, and then we sort of surrender our oil to multinational corporations. But in fact, having returned to power, Mr. Andres Perez decided to go to the International Monetary Fund, surrendered the economy, produced an austerity situation which led to the Caracazo and eventually the emergence of Hugo Chavez, whose birthday it is today, and the movement that won the election in 1998. It's important to reflect on that, because in many ways, people like Leopoldo Lopez, Marie Machado, and of course the candidate, I mean, he's a Potemkin candidate. You know, Mr. Guterres is not really the candidate for the presidency. Behind him is Machado, who's puppeteering this whole business. But these people want to U-turn Venezuela back to the 1990s, return to the International Monetary Fund, return to a kind of austerity for the poor, austerity for the working class, surrender the oil to the big multinational corporations, and allow the wealthy, the old oligarchy, to take back what they think is their own. That's what the right, the opposition, wants for Venezuela. On the other hand, you have the Bolivarian project, which has been struggling to break out of the stranglehold of the illegal unilateral sanctions by the United States, wants to find a way to diversify the economy, trying to utilize the new rebalancing in the world order, the emergence of China, the emergence of Russia, the help given by Turkey and so on, to use this rebalancing to find a way for Venezuela to break out of the shackles of US imposed sanctions. That's the clear choice in this election. Either you want to return, back to the future, to the 1990s with the opposition, or you want to struggle ahead to try to build a decent society for all the people in Venezuela. There's no third choice on this ballot, even though there are other candidates. There's no third way. These are the two ways. Whatever criticisms one might have of the situation, this is not the time to think about those criticisms. Obviously, there's lots of scope for improvement, but we got a pretty clear choice here. Either you go back to 1995 or you go ahead to 2025.
That is clear. And now that we have the time to really think about Venezuela and what's at stake, commune organization has been widely highlighted as one of the key aspects to understand the Venezuelan model. Does Venezuela represent the search for a new type of socialist production? And if so, how do you view it?
Well, very frankly, I think the communes, cooperatives and so on play a very major role in democratizing production for consumption by people. You need to find a way to bring democracy into the economy. But communes by themselves will not be enough. I mean, once the revenue starts streaming into Venezuela, it's very important to build the net fixed capital, to build infrastructure, to build better roads, build bridges, build productive forces in agriculture and so on. Very important to go in that road as well. Venezuela needs both the communes and it needs the bridges and factories. You need both things to have a balanced economy. And right now, the United States government, helped along by the European Union and other forces, have very skillfully prevented Venezuela from building up its net fixed capital, from building bridges, from building hospitals, from building industry and so on. They've skillfully suffocated this sector of the Venezuelan economy. And now is the point, I think, in a third term for Mr. Maduro, where emphasis needs to be placed on building the physical plant of Venezuela, upgrading institutions around the country. This has to be the opposite of what Javier Milei is doing in Argentina. Mr. Milei, who's locked arms with the opposition in Venezuela, is destroying the Argentinian economy. He's cannibalizing that economy. You can't live in a world of cannibalism. You have to provide a world where people are able to democratically have an economy in which they are breathing and being full human beings. And I think that's precisely what's on the table for a third term for Mr. Nicolas Maduro.
Thank you, Vijay, for joining us and also for giving us such a good read on what is really at stake today. Thank you for being here in Venezuela Decides.